What up, what up, what up, y'all? Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation of to create a model for deep learning. The whole goal of this is to empower you to better navigate your college classes. I really do believe that colleges are not designed to be student friendly, and many of the struggles that I faced in college and I see so many of my students face have to do with bad policies that do not support student learning, but that are designed to do basically resource allocation, right? Minimize the cost of college independent of that effect on learning. So one of my antidotes to that is I encourage my students to develop themselves, their identity as learners, both to understand what learning is and how it works. And then once they have a strong understanding of what learning is and how it works for them, then we can develop strategies to navigate a quote unquote unjust system, right? A system that is not really designed to do justice to your learning, but is designed to solve other problems for policymakers, right? So with that said, we're on our way to developing kind of a rich understanding of what learning means. We've had two different definitions of it. Remember that we started with, let me go to my website. So if you type in appliedlinearalgebra.com, it's a website that I've been building for about 8 years. If you go over to blog, scroll down to Jeff's TLC blog post, that's the learning code. These are my blog posts that I've been writing. If you go down to what is deep learning, we've already talked about those in two separate videos. We have definition of learning, and then we have a definition of deep learning. And we also talked about a definition of shallow learning. If you haven't watched those videos or read that blog post, I would encourage it, because in this video, what we're going to do is talk about a model for deep learning. So if you go up to number 10 here, this was published on March 7th, 2021. This model for deep learning is actually a visual representation of the deep learning process. And I'm actually going to pull up the PDF document that I used to create this. Okay, so remember that the concept of learning is all about creating, activating brain cells, interconnecting brain cells, creating a neural network, and then strengthening those interconnections. And one of the really interesting things about the neuroscience of learning, the cognitive science results, is that our brain seems to develop best when we challenge ourselves. I look at this as analogous to exercise. So if we think about the brain as a muscle, so let's think about our biceps. If I want to grow my biceps, one of the things that I do is I engage in a process called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the idea, maybe you've heard of the word of atrophy. We've talked about this in the previous video. Atrophy means to waste away. So literally, if I don't use my muscle ever, if I just lay in bed all day, my body will atrophy because it eats muscles to provide glucose into my blood. Hypertrophy is the opposite idea. So let's say that right now I go into my garage and I do 3 sets of 10 pull-ups. Then I take barbells, 20-pound barbells, and I do maybe 3 sets of 10. I'm going to be actually breaking muscle fibers. I'm literally pulling muscle fibers apart and straining them. So when I do that type of exercise, I am literally hurting my body. So when I take rest, what ends up happening is that my body recognizes that there has been damage done. And then in that rest period, sends resources, nutrients, proteins, etc., to rebuild the muscle fibers. And during the rebuild process, the muscle fibers actually, the muscle themselves and all of the bones, the ligaments, tendons get stronger than before the process. That's called hypertrophy. Hyper growth. We're growing back more than it happens. This is why karate experts, I don't know if you've ever seen this, karate experts will actually do micro fractures on their bone. So you'll, like, martial artists will take stuff and break their bones in small things, because when the bone heals back, the bone is then stronger than it was before, and it turns into a weapon. Like, they turn their body into a weapon. That's called hypertrophy in athletics. Now, if we go over to brain growth, I like to think about the same thing happening. When we stress our brain, when we really push ourselves to do deep learning, we stay focused, distraction-free, and we're trying hard things that we've never done before, we are literally activating cells that we might not have activated, or making connection between cells that we've never made before. And when that happens, our brain is stretching in the same way our muscles would stretch, right? Now, we can't do that for too long. Just like I can't work out for 15 hours a day, I can't do deep learning for 15 hours a day because I reach a limit, I reach a capacity. And you'll kind of feel that burnout. That's something that we're going to learn to feel as we get more and more advanced in our learning skills. So the point, though, is that in order to engage in deep learning, we have to struggle. And what the model that I want to develop is really highlighting the type of struggle that we want to do. So I'm going to use this language. So this comes from Daniel Coyle's work. It's an extension of that, but it's a visual representation of the concept of deep learning. So one of the things that in the science of learning that we talk a lot about is called productive struggle. And productive struggle is the idea that you're not doing things that are too easy, that you're really doing things that are hard enough to be difficult, but not hard enough to be impossible. So this graph here is going to represent the search for the sweet spot. The sweet spot is the difficulty level in which things are still interesting enough to produce learning results. So as we see here, this y-axis, the vertical axis here, we're going to call this difficulty level. So down at the origin, we would say this is really not difficult. So for example, right now, sitting in this chair is not hard for me, right? So in terms of my physical body, I have 0 difficulty level. If I were to go outside right now and try to lift 200 or 300 pounds in a bench press, that would be extremely difficult. In fact, it'd be too hard for me. So what we see along the vertical axis, very easy, little harder, little harder, little harder. And then as we get up really high, this is too hard, right? So over here, we're going to call the horizontal axis time spent learning. Reaching, repeating, and practicing. So this is the time that you spend engaged in a learning activity. We're going to break up the difficulty level into zones. So we're going to say that very, very easy tasks, we're going to call that the comfort zone. I put that in yellow, as in like, ooh, if I'm looking for deep learning, slow down. This is not the way to develop deep learning. So easy tasks that I already know how to do or that I'm very good at, like sitting in this chair, it's easy for me. It's not easy for a 9-month-old baby, let me tell you. This is a swivel chair. So that would be a 9-month-old baby sitting in this chair. They might be in their sweet spot. Me sitting in this chair, super easy. I've done this 1,000 times, right? So that's in my comfort zone. As I go up a little bit and it gets harder, we're going to call a spot where it's really hard, where I'm engaging in deep learning. It's not too hard, but it's really good for me. It's making me work. We're going to call that my sweet spot. So the sweet spot is the space where deep learning happens. Comfort zone is too easy, maybe even a bit below boring. Sweet spot, this is where productive struggle happens. It's where deep learning happens. In between the comfort zone and the sweet spot, we're going to say is the threshold for deep learning, right? I draw it as a line here. You see that green line? That means I'm looking for something that's hard enough to be interesting, right? Not too easy, right in my sweet spot. So that's the threshold for deep learning. So vertical axis is difficulty level. If it's too easy, it's in my comfort zone. It's too easy, maybe a bit boring. I'm looking to get in my sweet spot, which is hard enough to be interesting. The difference between those is the threshold for deep learning. That's where deep learning starts. Okay. Eventually, though, as I go harder and harder and harder, that is my upper limit for deep learning. So if I push too hard, I get into what I call the survival zone. This comes from Daniel Coyle's work again. You can read this in both the Little Book of Talent and also the Learning, the Talent Code. This is both great books about the science of skill development. So the survival zone is too difficult or way beyond my capacity, right? So let me just we're going to talk a little bit about time spent learning, and we're going to unpack this entire model. I'm going to give you some examples of what we mean by this in terms of physical capacity, and then we're going to develop an idea for learning capacity. So when you're in a college class and you're trying to develop expertise in a particular field, how might you begin to understand where your comfort zone is, where your sweet spot is, and where your survival zone is? Okay, so for my athletic analogy, I haven't worked out in a while. I have 2 young kids and I spend a lot of time working, and then immediately when I'm done, I do work with them. And so I haven't actually done bench presses or push-ups systemically for a while. If I were to go into a gym right now and try to do bench presses, just flat bench, bar and I'm literally laying on the ground and then I just push up. That's called a bench press, right? I think I could easily lift probably anywhere between 0 and 100 pounds probably. So 100 pounds would be a regular 45-pound bar. Maybe you put 15s on each side. That's 30 plus 45 is 75. Maybe 25s on each side. That's 50 plus 45 is 95. So right around the 100 to 110 pounds, I would start to struggle a little bit for sure, because I haven't done it in a while because I'm a dad, right? So right around 110 pounds, that would be my threshold for deep learning. In this case, deep learning is encoding muscular strength in my chest. And then as I go up from 110, I would say right around the 150 mark, I think I could probably do legitimately maybe 5 to 10 reps of 150 at this point. I would be sore as can be the next day. But right around 150, I would be starting to get to my upper limit for deep learning. Now, if you were to ask me honestly, I probably could put up 160 to 180 right now. But if I did that, I might actually tear something because it's been so long since I've done that, right? So my upper limit for deep learning would be right around 150, I would say right now. And then if I go higher than that, it's too much because I just can't handle it. So in terms of physical learning, that would be those lines for me at this moment, right? In terms of thinking about, I think a lot about math skills. So one of the things that's really interesting about developing math concepts is when a teacher asks you to solve a problem that you've solved before and that you remember the solution for, you're probably in your comfort zone. But if a teacher asks you to solve a problem that you've never solved before, involving new ideas, and or asks you to solve a problem that you've solved before, but you don't remember it, that's usually in your threshold for deep learning. And good teaching involves what we call scaffolding. So you break up really, really hard tasks into a sequence of smaller tasks so that you're kind of protecting your students against their survival zone before you even meet them, right? So you kind of break up a quarter so that students progressively get deeper and deeper into the theory, and you're never pushing them beyond your limits. And so one of the things that I think a lot about in my math classes is if a teacher is assigning homework that you know how to do, it's probably in your comfort zone. I like to say that on any given type of problem, you really only need maybe one, and if you really need 2 examples, if you're doing more than 2 examples of the same type, my claim is you're probably staying in your comfort zone too much, right? And we'll talk a lot about that later, the idea that if you're really developing your expertise on a problem, you can study the same problem for 3, 4, 5 hours, maybe multiple days in a row, and still get value on it. This is the idea of multiple representations. And so one thing that I like to say to my students is when you're learning, look for things that challenge you and then stay away from rote learning, stuff that you're forced to do just for the sake of getting it done, and it doesn't push you very hard. As you're engaging with your teachers, recognize that many of your teachers might not have developed this level of expertise in learning. Isn't it amazing? College teachers have 0 training. Many college teachers have 0 training in what learning is, how it works, and how to teach. They get their job because they're content experts. Now, given they know a lot about what it means to learn, and they probably have an intuitive grasp of this, but one of the very funny things about college is we overtask our teachers. So teachers are worked far beyond their capacity. Many of your teachers are producing research at a really high level, and then they're teaching like 300 students. It's physically impossible to do those jobs. And so in those moments, teachers will try their best to assign stuff to produce results, but often the best measure of deep learning is you, right? You know whether or not something's hard for you. So one of the things that I want to do as we develop this is get you used to thinking about, hey, this is in my comfort zone. Oh, you know what? I think this one's in my sweet spot. Oop, I think this is my survival. This is too hard, right? So that you can accurately assess the type of tasks that your teachers are asking you to do. Okay, so once we have this concept of comfort zone, sweet spot, and survival zone, I want to kind of highlight the phases of learning. We're going to get into this in a future part of our model here. I call them stages of learning. But the concept is that in the early part of doing deep learning, you're in what I would call like the neural network development stage. You're not in the strengthening stage. You're literally just creating a new neural network, right? So when you're first starting something and you get here, in these early stages, you're developing expertise for the first time. And one of the really interesting things about deep learning is that it requires a long time commitment. So if you've only spent an hour learning something, my claim is that is not what I would call robust learning. That is learning that will go away really, really quickly. Really good deep learning happens over long periods of time. This is why I tend to suggest against cramming. Think about athletics. Could you work out 5 times in one day for 2 hours each and expect huge results in your body, like looking like Thor from one of the Avengers movie? No, right? That's not how your body works. But if you decrease the intensity, 2 hours one day, 2 hours the next day, 2 hours the day after that, and then do that over a year, all of a sudden your body will encode that learning in ways that you can see. And the same thing is true when we develop deep expertise in something. It's usually because we've done deep learning. We've stayed in the sweet spot over long periods of time. We do a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit the next day, over weeks and months at a time. And all of a sudden we develop expertise in a subject. The 2 things I wanted to highlight in this graph: one, there are some times where we drop out of the sweet spot. And there's kind of 2 different ways that I think about this. One of those is called internal issues, and the other one is called external issues. So there are times when we're young, when we're trying something really, really hard and we doubt ourselves, right? So if you're in the sweet spot, this is really hard, and you could, in fact, it requires a lot of energy and a lot of struggle. And there are many times where you might say, this is too hard and I don't feel like doing it. And you drop out of the sweet spot. You put yourself down into the comfort zone. And that might be happening because you doubt yourself, you're not interested in the struggle, or you want to avoid work for some reason. Maybe you're tired, you have other stuff going on in your life, you have bigger problems to solve outside of the learning you're being forced to do, right? So that's one type of reason why we might drop out of our sweet spot. But I want to actually highlight another reason, which is harmful and ineffective teaching or coaching strategies. And this might include racism, sexism, and oppressive policies, right? One of the really interesting things about learning in classroom environments is that we learn within our society. And there are a lot of harmful, oppressive policies in our society that show up in microcosms in our classroom. So one of the triggers that I want you to kind of know for yourself is there are many times where teachers will develop policies that make us demotivated to learn, right? That drop us back into our comfort zone. And so one of the things that we have to do as students in classes like that is develop coping mechanisms by which we can counteract those harmful policies so that we can stay in our sweet spot. And we also have to develop support networks that address our self-doubt. Good teachers will do this automatically. A good teacher recognizes that deep learning is really hard in the early stages, and they will give a lot of compliment and encouragement and inspiration in the early stages. This is what I like to say: compliments are great for novices because it helps us develop belief and counteract the self-doubt that inevitably comes from doing deep learning in the early stages. So assuming that we have strategies to get us over the hump, so to speak, to keep us in that sweet spot over a long period of times, after we've initially developed what we call the neural network to encode a new skill or new knowledge, eventually what happens is we start to strengthen that. That's where we myelinate our nerve cells and strengthen the interconnectivities. So much so that if we continue to do this over long periods of time, what happens is our skill level rises, and what used to be really, really difficult is now really, really easy. This is why you might call really expert performers superheroes, because what looks really effortless to them would be almost impossible to us. And that is not a function of innate, genetic code. It's a function of the type of practice that they do and the intensity in which they do it, as well as the number of times that they repeat it over long periods of time. So I like to call that that spot where we drop out of our sweet spot, not because we're not because the skill is not hard, but because our ability has exceeded the particular practice that we're doing. I call this unconscious competence, which we'll talk about, which means that I've mastered this particular skill in this process session. I'm ready for the next challenge, right? Okay, so The goal of deep learning is to engage in focused, distraction-free practice on hard tasks at the edge of our capacity. In this model, what that means is to put ourselves into the sweet spot and to stay in that sweet spot as long as we can until what used to be hard becomes easy. This requires that we have strategies to get over our self-doubt, disinterest, and work avoidance, and also to counteract ineffective or harmful teaching practices of coaches and mentors, right? And that often involves creating entire networks, social networks, learning communities that will help us push past our limits. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of this. This blog post, which I'll link to in the description, talks a lot more about this. And of course, what I'm going to say is these videos are designed to keep you, to get you engaged in this, but the real learning doesn't happen by watching me. The real learning happens by thinking about and reflecting on what you're looking at and yourself. So I have some community challenge questions here for you. Think about something that you've learned deeply in your past. This could be a sport, a musical instrument, your favorite topic in school, or anything that you spent hundreds of hours working on. What did it feel like to be in your sweet spot? How did you get into that space? Who were the people that helped you enter this space of learning? Why did you want to enter your sweet spot on this activity for so long, right? What was it? What were the conditions that made you want to challenge yourself? Okay, so next question. Think about some of the learning that you are currently doing that is not fun for you, that you don't find fun. Why do you find yourself disinterested in this learning? What would it take for you to get excited about this learning? Who are some people who could help you want to learn more about whatever subject you're thinking about right now? And then how might you build a community to help you get excited and turn this learning into a social activity? All right. What type of feelings, next question, what type of feelings do you have when someone else forces you into your survival zone without your permission? Remember, your survival zone is when it's too hard. How does it affect your learning when someone forces you into your survival zone? How often do your college professors push you into your survival zone in a typical lecture? How does that make you feel about your learning? Remember, most college professors are content experts in a system that does not prioritize deep learning and doesn't support this type of work. So I like to say that individual professors are not why deep learning is so hard. Problematic policies are why deep learning is so hard. I have another post on that. This one, Why is Deep Learning So Hard, talks a lot about why college makes deep learning almost impossible in so many circumstances. Okay, so the final question in this reflection is, how would your life change if you had individual relationship with master coaches who understood this model for learning and spent time really getting to know you, who you are, who your family is, what interests you have, what you want in your future? What would that be like? What would it feel like if you could craft your own learning with frequent feedback, guidance about how to stay in your sweet spot, and how to relate those ideas to topics that you're learning in classes? So what would it be like to have a college system that was designed on that type of learning? All right, y'all, I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing you. We're going to keep going. There's some more really beautiful ideas about the 5 stages of deep learning, and then what type of activities allow you to engage and move from one stage to the next. I'll see you in those videos.